Why Thomas Sowell Should Be Recognized as a Member of the UCLA School of Economics by Spencer Antonio Marlen-Starr, published on September 15th, 2023, on my Medium blog under my name, Spencer Antonio Marlen-Starr. Abstract. Thomas Sowell, a renowned economist, social theorist, and political philosopher, has made significant contributions to the field of economics. While his work is widely recognized, it is often overlooked in the context of the UCLA School of Economics, which has been influential in shaping modern economic thought. This paper argues that Sowell's intellectual contributions align closely with the principles and methodologies of the UCLA School, particularly those of its most well-known members, Armin Alchian and Harold Demsetz. Through an analysis of Sowell's work and its thematic similarities with the UCLA School, this paper aims to establish Sowell as a fellow traveler of this intellectual tradition, along with both the Chicago School of Economics and the Austrian School of Economics, both of which he has already been recognized as a fellow traveler to. End of abstract. Introduction. The UCLA School of Economics, represented most famously by the eminent economists Armin Alchian and Harold Demsetz, has been a cornerstone in the development of sound economics. Their work on property rights, transaction costs, vertical integration, industrial organization, regulation, and evolutionary forces in market economies has had a profound impact on economics as a discipline, although some people, myself included, think their impact has not gone far enough as of yet. Unfortunately, even when this important school of economic thought is brought up in discussions among economists, one name that is seldom mentioned is Thomas Sowell. Despite his being recognized, although it must be admitted, to a larger extent among the informed public than among academic scholars these days, for the role he has played in educating the informed public in sound economics with his book, Basic Economics, which is the best-selling economics book in the United States for many years now. Sowell is rarely associated with the UCLA School of Economics in terms of his unique approach to economic analysis, even though his work exhibits strong thematic and methodological similarities with its core principles and themes. I'm sorry to say this, but I fear that part of the reason for his name not being included is because many professional economists do not take Thomas Sowell's contributions to economics seriously. And I am by no means the first person to observe this influence of the UCLA School's way of thinking on Sowell. For instance, in his 1981 review of Sowell's book, Knowledge and Decisions, the future Nobel laureate in economics, James Buchanan, noted, quote, "A third element that emerges, but again, not obtrusively, will be recognized as a property rights approach to the explanation of observed behavior. Sowell has not been a colleague of Armin Alchian without benefit." End of quote. After I discovered that Buchanan made the same observation as I had, I did several searches using Google Scholar, Google, Bing, Bing AI, and ResearchGate to see if there have been any papers written on Sowell as a member of the UCLA School of Economics to date, and alas, there has not. And despite this, Sowell is mentioned in The Essential UCLA School of Economics, a 2021 book by Globerman and Henderson, but he is only mentioned in the literal sense of the word in the second to last paragraph of the first chapter in the following manner, quote, "Not to be missed in a summary of contributions by UCLA economists is the work of Thomas Sowell. He wrote his 1975 book, Race and Economics, a precursor to his much more extensive work on the economics of various ethnic groups while at UCLA." End of quote. This shout out to Sowell got me excited and looking forward to an explanation later on in the book as to how his economic analysis and approach was influenced by his time at the UCLA Economics Department in its golden era, which includes examples and quotations. I was excited because if they had done this, I would not have to write this article, which I had been putting off for years. But that was the only reference to Sowell in their book, and by itself, it is rather underwhelming, to put it mildly, given just how much of the style of economic analysis of the UCLA school has been exhibited by Sowell, as the reader will see throughout this article. I reached out to David Henderson, one of the two authors, to ask him why more on Sowell's economics was not included in their book. I would have reached out to Stephen Globerman as well, but I couldn't find him on LinkedIn or Facebook. And if he thinks Tom deserves recognition as at least a partial member or fellow traveler to the UCLA School of Economics, but I never got a reply. Absent a reply, the only explanation for why they didn't include more about Sowell is because he's black and they can't handle that. That was a joke, folks. Just kidding around. After after I failed to get a reply from Henderson, I reached out to Jason Riley, author of the recent intellectual biography of Thomas Sowell called Maverick, which was published in 2021, which coincidentally was published the same year as the essential UCLA School of Economics, but he never responded either. I was discouraged enough by a lack of a reply back in July of 2023 that I decided not to move forward with writing this article, one which I had originally realized ought to be written by someone over several years ago. However, in August, I came up with the clever idea of asking the Austrian economist and historian of economic thought, Peter Boettke, what he thinks of my observation and or thesis, because he has written at least one paper about Alchian, Boettke and Candela 2014, and more importantly, because he is a professor in George Mason University's brilliant economics department, a school where I happen to have just obtained my master's degree in data analytics engineering from in May of 2023. So I thought he would respond given my GMU email address, and luckily I was right. He called it a, quote, very astute observation, unquote. And that was all I needed to know that I wasn't crazy and to pull the trigger finally on writing this article, which I knew would require a lot of work to be able to do the right way. Armin Alchian's Evolutionary Economics and the Systematic Effects of Competition. One of the most striking aspects of Thomas Sowell's work is his application of evolutionary economics, a framework that aligns closely with the contributions put forth by Armin Alchian in his landmark paper Uncertainty, Evolution, and Economic Theory, which was published in 1950 in the Journal of Political Economy. Sowell's understanding of how systematic evolutionary forces shape individual and organizational behavior is evident in his discussions of many different topics across many of his books. For example, in his seminal book, Basic Economics, Sowell addresses some of the complexities surrounding the measurement of the employment effects of minimum wage laws. He writes, quote, even though most studies show that unemployment tends to increase as minimum wages are imposed or increased, those few studies that seem to indicate otherwise have been hailed in some quarters as having refuted this myth. However, one common problem with research on the employment effects of minimum wage laws is that surveys of employers before and after a minimum wage increase can survey only those particular businesses which have survived in both periods. Given the high rates of business failures in many industries, the results for the surviving businesses may be completely different from the results of the industry as a whole. End of quote. In empirical scholarship generally, this is known as survivorship bias, and the way Sowell points to that bias as a methodological drawback to any survey-based studies of the effects of minimum wage increases on employment echoes Alchian's emphasis on the evolutionary nature of market competition. Thomas is implicitly focusing on the possibility that the types of business firms which can survive a given change in government policy, for example, types, may have already been more well adapted to the economic landscape. In other words, to their environment after that change, for example, being less labor intensive, than the types of firms which went extinct via bankruptcy afterwards. Even when assumed there were the same number of firms in a given industry which employs a large number of low-wage workers, take the fast food industry as an example, a year after a minimum wage hike as there were a year before due to the entrance of an equal number of new firms into that industry as the number of firms which exited, so long as the ones which went under over that year tended to be more labor intensive than the average rate in the industry at the time the hike occurred, and the new entrants had the same rate of labor intensiveness as the prior industry average, that alone would lead to a decrease in employment in that industry, and the magnitude of that disemployment effect would increase if the new firms which entered the industry over the years since the minimum wage increase have lower levels of labor intensiveness than the previous industry average. This is a straightforward application of the distinction made by Alchian in his 1950 paper Uncertainty, Evolution, and Economic Theory between economic agents, in this case the decision makers at firms, actively adapting to a changed environment, typically said to be spurred on by incentives and disincentives, and the ability of the economic environment to adopt relatively efficient survivors, even in the absence of any deliberate adaptive behavior. Below is how Alchian describes this distinction in that paper. Quote, first, consider the simplest type of biological evolution. Plants grow to the sunny side of buildings, not because they want to, in awareness of the fact that optimum or better conditions prevail there, but rather because the leaves that happen to have more sunlight grow faster and their feeding systems become stronger. Similarly, animals with configurations and habits more appropriate for survival under prevailing conditions have an enhanced viability and will with higher probability be typical survivors. Less appropriately acting organisms of the same general class, having lower probabilities of survival, will find survival difficult. More common types of survivors may appear to be those having adapted themselves to the environment, whereas the truth may well be that the environment has adopted them. There may have been no motivated individual adapting, but instead only environmental adopting. End of quote. In Knowledge and Decisions, Sowell delves into the topic wage disparities and discrimination, challenging the conventional wisdom that attributes such disparities solely to prejudice. He writes, quote, much of the literature on racial or sexual prejudices and their discriminatory economic effects, for example, proceeds in utter disregard of knowledge validation processes, such as competition in the marketplace. It has often been asserted that women receive only about two-thirds of what men receive for doing the same work. While this assertion is open to very serious challenges on empirical grounds, the more relevant analytical point here is that it treats employers' perceptions as if they were independent of the validation processes of economic competition. End of quote. Sowell goes on to illustrate what would be the economic repercussions of such discriminatory practices to business owners who actually engaged in them. Quote, for women to be paid only two-thirds of what men are paid for doing the same work with the same productivity would mean that an employer's total labor costs would be 50% higher than necessary with an all-male labor force. If all that was involved was blind prejudice, that might seem to be a viable situation, but even a cursory consideration of the economic implications of trying to compete and survive in the marketplace with labor costs 50% higher than they need to be must at the very least raise serious questions. End of quote. Sowell's argument here is not merely an appeal to enlightened self-interest, but rather an acknowledgement of the systemic Darwinian forces at play, as is made clear when he says, quote, similarly, the owner of a professional basketball team might read Mein Kampf and become a convinced racist. But if he were then to refuse to hire black basketball players, would there be no economic repercussions? Or would he be more likely to disappear as a professional basketball club owner via the bankruptcy courts? End of quote. The type of reasoning exhibited in the final sentence above is deeply rooted in Alchian's evolutionary economics, which posits that market competition serves as a natural selection mechanism which winnows out those whose decisions diverge most from reality. or as Alchian puts it in his aforementioned 1950 paper, only those firms whose decisions are close enough or fit enough to what would work best for the market at a given time, i.e., whose goods and services would be most commensurate with consumer demand, are adopted by the economic environment. In this context, Sowell's work serves as a compelling extension of the UCLA School's focus on how economic agents adapt, survive, or disappear in response to market forces. The animistic fallacy. Expanding on the theme of evolutionary economics, Thomas Sowell delves deeper into the role of time and systemic adaptations in shaping economic and social outcomes. His insights resonate strongly with Armin Alchian's emphasis on the evolutionary nature of economic processes once again. Sowell, quote, from the point of view of the social utilization of knowledge, time permits entirely different methods for the production and distribution of knowledge from those usually conceived of, and does not depend upon articulation, rationality, cognition, or any of the other formal processes taught in academic institutions. With unlimited time, either the processes of nature or the competition among men may lead to an intricate pattern of results unplanned by anybody. End of quote. This observation aligns closely with Alchian's view that competition serves as a form of natural selection in the marketplace, leading to outcomes that are not necessarily the result of rational planning or articulated knowledge. Sowell further elaborates on the pitfalls of attributing outcomes solely to intentional actions, terming it the animistic fallacy. Quote, perhaps the simplest and most psychologically satisfying explanation of any observed phenomenon is that it happened that way because someone wanted it to happen that way. Some events are in fact the result of purposeful activity toward the goal achieved, but the general presumption that this must be the case can be classified as the animistic fallacy. End of quote. Sowell explicitly cites Darwin to underscore the importance of evolutionary processes in understanding both natural and social phenomena. Here, quote, Darwin was a landmark, not only in the history of biology, but in the history of intellectual development in general. He showed how, with sufficient time, non-purposeful activity could lead to non-random results. Divorced order from design. Yet the animistic fallacy would say that the absence of planning must lead to chaos, and the economic and political consequences of that belief are still powerful today. End of quote. Sowell's work also extends to the realm of cultural and social adaptations, as he discusses the challenges and successes of different groups in adapting to urban environments. Quote, many of the attitudes, beliefs, and emphases of agrarian people are quite simple as adaptations to an agrarian environment. However counterproductive these approaches may turn out to be in an urban commercial setting, a fatalistic view of the future, for example, is fully understandable in a culture where people's whole lives hinge on the random variability of the weather. It is a challenge to try to find any group which emerged from centuries of agrarian life and became a success in an urban environment in just 1 or 2 generations. Conversely, the long urbanized Jews who became the most successful of all American ethnic groups in the cities in which they concentrated had an almost unbroken record of failure in agrarian undertakings in various parts of the United States. Generalized ability or discrimination seem to offer little explanation of such social phenomena as compared to the explanation of evolutionary adaptation. For other social phenomena, the results may be different. End of quote. In doing so, he challenges the presumptive priority of timeless, intentional explanations, echoing Alchian's focus on the evolutionary nature of economic processes once again. However, Sowell is of course careful, just as Alchian is in his paper, not to go too far by trying to use this alternative mechanism for how competition in a market economy selects winners and losers as the only such mechanism. That would throw out the standard role played in incentives in economic theory. He clarifies that the point here is not to deny any effect of intentional actions or even to claim that these are necessarily less than the effects of evolutionary social processes. The point is to challenge the presumptive priority of timeless intentional explanations, i.e., the animistic fallacy. End of quote. Next section. the interplay of rationalism and evolutionism in economics. Once again, in Knowledge and Decisions, Sowell illuminates the complex relationship between rationalism and evolutionism, two contrasting paradigms that have shaped economic thought. This dichotomy is particularly relevant to the UCLA School of Economics, which has long emphasized the evolutionary nature of economic processes, and more importantly, was the first to lay out an explicitly evolutionary framework for economic analysis. Sowell states, rationalism is at one end of it, with evolution at the other. The evolutionary process sees the determining rationality in process, unarticulated in whole, animals, or in part humans, not in the individuals involved in the process. End of quote. So then elaborates on the limitations of rationalism, especially when it comes to understanding complex social systems. Quote, when culture is conceived of as an evolutionary product, an ecology of human relations, it is by no means clear that any and all well-articulated reasons for changing particular parts of this social ecology must be valid. Even if plausible in the specific case, Pauli's unintended consequences throughout a complex system is a weighty consideration. End of quote. It's interesting to me as a side note that Sowell was already using the terminology of complex system when this book came out in 1980. That's fairly early compared to a lot of economists. Back to the article. Sowell's insights echo Altune's skepticism toward overly rationalistic models that ignore the evolutionary nature of economic processes. But at this point, that ought to be clear enough. But I did repeat it for a reason. It's very important. However, Alcune is not the only clear parallel I see here. Being that Thomas Sowell is my favorite author, living or dead, along with Nassim Taleb, I would be remiss if I failed to point out here that this sounds quite a lot like Taleb throughout The Black Swan, Antifragile, and Skin in the Game. Unfortunately, though, Sowell did not anticipate the insight of Taleb that you can go further and end up with more practical decision-making guidelines by distinguishing between what he terms via positiva, that is, adding on to what is extant, and via negativa, removing something or some government policy, perhaps which is currently in place. In the aforementioned books, Taleb argues that in a complex adaptive system, you require much less information to be able to anticipate the results of removing something, what he calls via negativa, than you do for the results of adding something new, what he calls via positiva. Continuing on with the long passage under consideration, Sowell further discusses the limitations of rationality in predicting outcomes. Quote, given the virtually limitless complexity of evolutionary or ecological processes, whether social or biological, the limited scope of even the most rational and well-informed mind, it is by no means inevitable that the wisest, hardest working, or otherwise best individuals will be most rewarded at any given point in time. Evolutionary processes may select the best results without selecting the most meritorious individuals. End of quote. This part of the passage not only further elaborates on the same theme we've been discussing, but it also implicitly pokes holes in a naive notion of meritocracy that has been and remains somewhat common by American conservatives and right-wing people alike. Elsewhere in Knowledge and Decisions, Sowell attacks this view explicitly as an animistic fallacy of the right and provides a non-animistic alternative framing of how a market economy works to this view of it as a meritocracy. If you want to read one quote where he attacks this, it is quoted at the very end of my review article of Knowledge and Decisions. Continuing on, Sowell then provides an illustrative example in the biological domain, followed by an example in the economic domain, and ties them together with a brilliant quote. Even in nature, the best fish, by whatever standard, will die in a lake that dries up in a drought, while weaker, less intelligent, poorer swimming fish will thrive in a body of water with abundant nutrients and few dangers. In a price-coordinated economy, those individuals who happen to be holding resources which suddenly acquire great value to others, for example, oil lands when uses were discovered for petroleum in the United States in the 19th century, grow rich in spite of themselves. The relevant question is not whether the best individuals are selected in this kind of process, but whether the best social result is obtained by such processes for moving resources, or whether alternative schemes would get what is wanted where it is wanted faster or better in some other sense. End of quote. Once again, this argument can be, and is elsewhere in the same book, explicitly turned against naive notions of highly successful businessmen thinking that they were just better than almost everyone else in any sense. Sowell then delves into the practical implications of these ideas. Quote, shortages, waiting lines, and production bottlenecks which accompany more apparently rational methods of allocating resources suggest that knowledge costs are a handicap that is more readily overcome when each holder of a valuable resource has an incentive to spread knowledge of its availability as quickly and widely as possible. End of quote. And he concludes this passage by emphasizing the systemic nature of rationality. Quote, in short, the Darwinian natural selection principle may mean a natural selection as a fittest situation or process, not necessarily individuals. The degree of rationality in the process is by no means limited to the degree of rationality of the individuals. This is often erroneously claimed. End of quote. By weaving these threads together, Sowell offers a comprehensive view of how evolutionary economics can be applied to a wide range of issues, from discrimination and wage disparities to cultural adaptations and social/societal outcomes, and also a stark contrast to the rationalistic perspective in a very poignant manner as well. These aspects of his scholarship serve as compelling applications of evolutionary economics framework first introduced by Marlen-Starr. Next section, the myth of the inevitability of chaos in a decentralized, that is, unplanned economy. In this section, I examine a long passage from Thomas Sowell's book, Intellectuals and Society, that delves into the common misconception among intellectuals that uncontrolled or unplanned economic systems would inevitably result in chaos. This perspective has strong parallels not only to the UCLA School of Economics, but also to the Chicago and Austrian schools as well. But before examining that passage written by Sowell, here's a quote in the same vein from the textbook University Economics, which was written by Marlen-Starr, along with fellow UCLA School economist William Allen. Quote, no person or group poses detailed questions of how the community is to use its resources, and no one imposes comprehensive answers to the questions. Yet such problems, large and small, are somehow solved daily. No agency is appointed to ensure that adequate food reaches every city and is allocated among competing claimants, and yet the people eat. End of quote. Along a similar line of inquiry, Sowell states, quote, among the other unsubstantiated notions about economics common among the intelligentsia is that there would be chaos in the economy without government planning or control. End of quote. Sowell challenges the idea that government control is the only path to order, arguing that systemic factors can also create patterns and structures. Quote, neither chaos nor randomness is implicit in uncontrolled circumstances. In a virgin forest, the flora and fauna are not distributed randomly or chaotically. Certain trees grow more abundantly at lower elevations and other kinds of trees at higher elevations. Above some altitude, no trees at all grow, and at the summit of Mount Everest, no vegetation at all grows. Obviously, none of this is a result of any decisions made by the vegetation. It depends on variations in surrounding circumstances, such as temperature and soil. It is a systemically determined outcome with pattern, not chaos. End of quote. Sowell uses the example of a virgin forest to illustrate how systemic factors rather than centralized planning can create order. He notes that vegetation and animal life are distributed in patterns that are influenced by environmental conditions. Quote, animal life also varies with environmental differences, and while animals, like humans and unlike vegetation, have thought and volition, that thought and volition are not always the decisive factors in the outcomes. End of quote. This aligns once again with Marlen-Starr's evolutionary economics, which also emphasizes the role of systemic factors in shaping economic outcomes. Sowell points out that individual choices are often constrained by these systemic factors. Quote, in short, between individual volition and general outcomes are systemic factors which limit or determine what will survive, creating a pattern rather than chaos. End of quote. Sowell's insights serve as compelling argument against the notion that uncontrolled economies are inherently chaotic. He suggests that systemic factors, much like natural selection in biological systems, can create order and patterns. This perspective resonates with Alchian's work, which also challenges overly rationalistic models that ignore the evolutionary and systemic nature of economic processes. Quote, none of this is difficult to understand in the natural environment, but the difference between individual volitional causation and constraining systemic causation is one seldom considered by intellectuals when discussing economies, unless they happen to be economists. End of quote. His final point in this long passage, in the two sentences quoted above, is more original to his angle on this topic. That angle being to point out that people are more likely to understand the role of bottom up, unplanned evolutionary effects in systems in the natural environment than they are in the social or economic environments of humans, a bias which he labels the animistic fallacy. Next section. Market concentration, innovation, and market power. The following quote is from a YouTube video called A Conversation with Harold Demsetz, starting at timestamp 17 minutes and 33 seconds into it. Quote, suppose that a firm makes a breakthrough in how to produce more cheaply at a larger scale, or how to produce a better product. That firm then begins to grow, to take market share away from other firms, its industry. And if it is very successful, it goes on doing this until the industry is concentrated. The industry becomes concentrated not because the firm wanted to become a monopoly so it could raise its prices. If that's all you needed for an industry to become concentrated, every industry would become concentrated. It got concentrated because this firm was doing better than the other firms did, that is, better at lowering its prices. End of quote. Demsetz argues that market concentration often occurs as a result of innovation and efficiency. A firm that finds a way to produce a better or cheaper product naturally gains market share, not because it aims to become a monopoly, but because it is more efficient or innovative. This is a form of market-driven concentration that benefits consumers. In the following quote from his 1973 paper, Industry Structure, Market Rivalry, and Public Policy, Harold Demsetz makes the same point as he articulated verbally in the quote from the interview which I just read, but in a much more precise and analytical style. I included both just in case one of them is easier to understand than the other. Quote, under the pressure of competitive rivalry and in the apparent absence of effective barriers to entry, it would seem that the concentration of an industry's output in a few firms could only derive from the superiority in producing and marketing products, or in the superiority of a structure of industry in which there are only a few firms. In a world in which information and resource mobility can be secured only at a cost, an industry will become more concentrated under competitive conditions only if a differential advantage in expanding output develops in some firms. Such expansion will increase the degree of concentration at the same time that it increases the rate of return that these firms earn. The cost advantage that gives rise to increased concentration may be reflected in scale economies or in downward shifts in positively sloped marginal cost curves, or it may be reflected in better products which satisfy demand at a lower cost. End of quote. Sowell echoes this by pointing out that when a company gains a large market share, it's often because consumers prefer its products. He argues that the term control is misleading in this context, as consumers are free to switch to different competitors at any time. In essence, both scholars assert that market concentration is not inherently bad. because it can be the result of better business practices that ultimately benefit the consumer. Here is an extremely long passage from Sowell's 2010 book, Intellectuals in Society, which expresses the same argument as Demsetz does in the two quotes above. Quote, and again, before I start, I must emphasize a second time, this is a very long quote. Anyway, one of the many signs of verbal virtuosity among intellectuals is the repackaging of words to mean things that are not only different from, but sometimes the direct opposite of their original meanings or the meaning that most other people attach to those words. Freedom and power are among the most common of these repackaged words. The basic concept of freedom as not being subjected to other people's restrictions, and of power as the ability to restrict other people's options, have both been stood on their heads in some of the repackaging of these words by intellectuals discussing economic issues. Thus, business enterprises which expand the public's options either quantitatively through lower prices or qualitatively through better products are often spoken of as controlling the market, whenever this results in a high percentage of consumers choosing to purchase their particular products rather than the competing products of other enterprises. In other words, when consumers decide that particular brands of products are either cheaper or better than competing brands of those products, third parties take it upon themselves to depict those who produce these particular brands as having exercised power or control. If, at a given time, three-quarters of the consumers prefer to buy the American Acme brand of widgets to any other brand, then Acme Inc. will be said to control three-quarters of the market, even though consumers control 100% of the market, since they can switch to another brand of widgets tomorrow if someone else comes up with a better widget, or stop buying widgets altogether if a new product comes along that makes widgets obsolete. Any number of companies that have been said to control a majority of their market have not only lost that market share, but have gone bankrupt within a few years of their supposed dominance in the market. Smith Corona, for example, sold over half the typewriters and word processors in the United States in 1989. But just 6 years later, it filed for bankruptcy as the spread of personal computers displaced both typewriters and word processors. Yet the verbal packaging of sales statistics ex post as market control ex ante has been common, not only in the writings of the intelligentsia, but even in courts of law and antitrust cases. Even at its peak, Smith Corona controlled nothing. Every consumer was free to buy any other brand of typewriter or word processor, or refrain from buying any. The verbal packaging of consumer choice as business control has become so widespread that few people seem to feel a need to do anything so basic as thinking about the meaning of the words they are using, which transform an ex post statistic into an ex ante condition. By saying that businesses have power because they have control of their markets, this verbal virtuosity opens the way to saying that government needs to exercise its countervailing power, John Kenneth Galbraith's phrase, in order to protect the public. Despite the verbal parallels, government power is in fact power, since individuals do not have a free choice as to whether or not to obey government laws and regulations, while consumers are free to ignore the products marketed by even the biggest and supposedly most powerful corporations in the world. There are people who have never set foot in a Walmart store, and there is nothing that Walmart can do about it. Absolutely nothing, despite being the world's largest retailer. At this point, I switched to further down, continuing the quote. I didn't include every single sentence and paragraph. One of John Kenneth Galbraith's earliest and most influential books, American Capitalism, The Concept of Countervailing Power, declared that, quote, subquote, power on one side of a market creates both the need for and the prospect of reward to the exercise of countervailing power from the other side, end of subquote. Thus, according to Professor Galbraith, the rise of big corporations gave them an oppressive power over their employees, which led to the creation of labor unions and self-defense. As a matter of historical fact, however, It was not large mass production industries that American labor unions began, but in industries with numerous smaller businesses such as construction, trucking, and coal mining, all of which were unionized years before the steel or automotive industries. But whatever the genesis of Union power, the crucial countervailing power for Galbraith was that of the federal government, both in support of private countervailing power with such legislation as the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 and legislation to help coal producers and others supposedly oppressed by the power of big business. Such government countervailing power performs a valuable, indeed an indispensable regulatory function in the modern economy, according to Galbraith. But this formulation depends crucially on redefining power to include its opposite, the expansion of consumer options by businesses in order to increase sales. John Kenneth Galbraith was perhaps the most prominent and certainly one of the most verbally gifted of the advocates of a theory of volitional pricing. According to Professor Galbraith, the output of a given industry tends to become more concentrated over time in the hands of a few producers who acquire decisive advantages that make it difficult for a new company without the same amount of experience to enter the industry and compete effectively against the leading incumbents. Therefore, according to Galbraith, subquote, sellers have gained authority over prices, end of subquote, which are, subquote, tacitly administered by a few large firms, end of subquote. In reality, one of the most common reasons for buyers buying disproportionately from a particular seller is that this seller has a lower price. After Galbraith has redefined power as a concentration of sales and of resulting profits and size, he is able to depict that power, the seller, as a reason why that seller can now set prices different from and implicitly higher than those of a competitive market. In this formulation, subquote, the size of the corporation which the individual heads is again a rough index of the power the individual exercises, end of subquote. However plausible all this might seem, Galbraith did not venture very far in the direction of empirical verification. The insinuation of Galbraith's, and of many others, discussions of the power of big business is that the growth of ever larger businesses means the growth of their power to raise prices. This insinuation, as distinguished from either a demonstrated fact or even a testable hypothesis, was a staple among the intelligentsia long before Galbraith's time, and provided the impetus for the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, among other attempts to contain the power of big business. In reality, the era leading up to the Sherman Act was not an era of rising prices imposed by monopolies, even though it was an era of growing sizes of businesses in many industries, often through consolidation of smaller businesses into giant corporations. Far from leading to higher prices, however, this was an era of falling prices charged by these larger businesses, whose size created economies of scale, which meant lower production costs that enabled them to profit from lower prices, thereby expanding their sales. Crude oil, which sold for $12 to $16 a barrel in 1860, sold for less than $1 a barrel in every year from 1879 until 1900. Railroad freight costs fell by uh, 1887 to 54% of what they had been in 1873. The price of steel rails fell from $68 in 1880 down to just $32 in 1890. That's less than half. 32 times 2 is 66. The prices of sugar, lead, and zinc all fell during this period. End of a really long quote from Thomas Sowell in Intellectuals in Society. Back to my words. It is clear from the two quotations above that both Demsetz and Sowell challenge conventional wisdom about market concentration and the notion of power or control that a firm might have in the market. They argue that market concentration is not necessarily a result of monopolistic tendencies or manipulative practices, but often arises from superior performance. In Demsetz's words, a firm that innovates and produces more efficiently will naturally grow and take market share away from less efficient competitors. Sowell echoes this sentiment by emphasizing that when a company controls a large market share, it's often because consumers prefer their product or find it more economical. Both scholars assert that this kind of market concentration is a result of consumer choice and competitive efficiency, and not a result of coercive power. Additionally, both scholars emphasize the role of competition as a self-correcting mechanism. Demsetz suggests that if a firm becomes too complacent or inefficient, it will lose market share to more innovative competitors. According to Henderson and Globerman, Demsetz argues that the, quote, long-lasting characteristics of the unregulated business world almost certainly reflect underlying efficiencies, and that industries that have been highly concentrated for years without government protection, that part's crucial, have done so only because producers in those industries serve consumers better than any seemingly feasible alternative industrial structure, end quote. He reasons that if that had not been the case, then market competition would have given rise to an alternative observable structure in that industry at some point. For his part, Sowell points to historical examples like Smith Corona, which went from market dominance to bankruptcy, as stark evidence that real companies cannot control consumer choice indefinitely, or even temporarily in any way when there's open entry and exit. In both views, competition serves as a natural check against the so-called power of large corporations. This all makes for a nuanced and empirically grounded perspective on industrial organization. They challenge the conventional narratives about market concentration, monopolistic power, and the need for government intervention. By focusing on consumer choice, competitive efficiency, and the self-correcting nature of markets, they provide a compelling counter-argument to the often simplistic and misleading portrayals of market dynamics. Their work serves as a crucial intellectual foundation for anyone interested in understanding the complexities of industrial organization, market power, and market competition. Next section. The role of private property rights. The weight of the examples discussed in this article, where I see clear evidence of Sowell's economics being influenced by his time spent at UCLA in the 70s, have been where he has used evolutionary reasoning and analysis thus far. And this is indeed a vital contribution made by Armin Alchian of that UCLA school. However, if you ask most economists what the main feature of the UCLA school's way of approaching economic analysis that sets it apart from the standard neoclassical approach, they would say the theory of property rights and the emphasis on it by UCLA school economists. Even having listened to 11 of Thomas Sowell's books at least once, 9 of them at least as I have, Sowell's use of this UCLA understanding of property rights can be too subtle to recognize at times, but 3 of them stood out enough for inclusion in this piece. But first, what is the UCLA School's understanding property rights? Here's an explanation of it from Thomas Sowell's longtime friend, the economist Walter Williams, who earned his doctorate in economics at UCLA during the 1960s when Alchian and Demsetz were in the most productive phases of their careers there. Williams states that private property rights contain 3 components. 1. The owner's rights to make decisions about the uses of their own property. 2. Their right to keep and dispose of their property. 3. Their right to enjoy the income as well as bear the losses resulting from their decisions. The first quote of Sowell's pertaining to property rights I'm going to share is one I actually didn't fully understand until I read Williams' explanation of the UCLA School's understanding of property rights. This quote from page 152 of Knowledge and Decisions, second edition, is Thomas Sowell's definition of socialism. He says socialism is a political and economic system which operates in strict accordance with the following rule. Quote, once the legal authorities have defined, combined, and assigned property rights, the subsequent recombination or interchange of those rights at the discretion of individuals shall be illegal. End of quote. The reason I didn't understand this at first is because when I put it in my notes, I added in or the part where it says interchange of those rights. I put or the goods. But the point of the property rights paradigm is that you don't own goods, you own rights to goods. Another related quote, insofar as it also pertains to both property rights and socialism, comes from page 125 of Knowledge and Decisions, where Sowell brilliantly highlights the important roles played by private property rights by explaining what happens in their absence. Quote, by creating monitors with a vested interest in the maximization of a given set of values, property rights reduce the social cost of monitoring efficiency. In systems of non-transferable property, the monitor's incentives are to maximize those valuables realizable during his own tenure, whether as inheritor of an entailed estate or as a member of a modern planning commission with a fixed term. Where the property is transferable at will, the present value of a property at any given time includes future values realizable long after the time horizon or even the lifetime of the existing property holder, who therefore has no incentive to restrict his maximization to the short run alone. In socialist systems, property transfers take place through political decisions to replace members of the planning bodies or to reorganize the planning structure itself. The property itself never belongs to those individuals, but they benefit both financially and psychically from managing it. And visibly successful management may create capital gain in the form of increased likelihood of promotion to higher levels of pay or power. All of this provides short-run incentives for short-run maximization of politically visible values. Morality, ideology, or a sense of history must then be relied upon as incentives for longer-run maximization policies. That such incentives apply to only a limited number of individuals or to the individuals only in a limited number of positions of historic visibility may be indicated by the fact that long-run investments in the Soviet economy are directed by only a few people at a time. Under short-run incentive structures, individual decision-making units tend to avoid technological innovations with short-run costs and long-run benefits as the devil shies away from incense, to quote, oh, excuse me then. It was a quote by Soviet Premier Brezhnev in a complaint about Soviet managers, so I'll say it as he would say it. As the devil shies away from incense. Again, Soviet Premier Brezhnev. End of quote. And a third quote from page 39 of Knowledge and Decisions further points to Sowell, like many other members of the UCLA School of Economics, having a more subtle, that is less literal in terms of only applying to the physical things which are owned themselves, understanding of property rights. Quote, restrictions on the legal or permitted future uses of property is a reduction in its present value, since one component of its present value is its future salability. In short, a reduction in property rights is a partial confiscation of property. To take 10% of the value of land is economically no different from taking away 10% of the land itself. End of quote. Next section, discussion. There are also more straightforward cases where Sowell explicitly cites scholarship from economists in the UCLA tradition. One example of this comes from page 184 of Knowledge and Decisions, where Sowell describes in detail how the transportation systems which were beginning to emerge in the early 20th century was changed by government intervention from how it would have emerged otherwise in very negative ways. In this, he cites the work of the UCLA economist George Hilton in his important work on the rise and demise of what were called jitneys, that is, owner-operated bus or taxi services by people who owned their own automobiles. This was basically a proto Uber or Lyft service, but all the way back in about 1905, 1910, or 1915-ish. To borrow the quotation that Sowell uses from Hilton in Knowledge and Decisions, quote, the jitneys were owner-operated vehicles which essentially provided a competitive market in urban transportation with the usual characteristics of rapid entry and exit, quick adaptation to changes in demand, and in particular, excellent adaptation to peak load demands. Some 60% of the jitney men were part-time operators, many of whom simply carried passengers for a nickel on trips between home and work. Consequently, cities were crisscrossed with an infinity of home-to-work routes every rush hour. The jitneys were put down in every American city to protect the street railways, and in particular, to perpetuate the cross-subsidization of the street railways' citywide fare structures. As a result, the public moved to automobiles as private rather than common carriers. End of quote. George Hilton, argued that the suppression of jitneys contributed to urban sprawl in American cities. Jitneys could have provided more flexible and efficient transportation options within city centers and to outlying areas. Without jitneys, people were more reliant on personal cars or less flexible public transit options, contributing to the spread of cities and making it more convenient for people to live farther away from city centers. After quoting the two paragraphs above from Hilton, Sowell commented in his own words on the effects and pointed out how these jitneys, which began emerging all the way back in 1914, were far superior to some of the supposed solutions which were being advocated for at the time of writing during the late 70s for reducing traffic congestion. Quote, in short, the cross-subsidy scheme not only distorted the location of homes and businesses, it artificially increased the need for private automobiles by forcibly preventing or restricting the sharing of cars through the market. Ironically, years later, some municipalities have tried to encourage carpools to reduce traffic congestion, but carpooling through non-market mechanisms requires far more knowledge than through the market for jitneys and conveys far less incentive for dependability and cooperation. End of quote. There are other topics I could have written a section on, one of which I had originally planned to write a section was on how Sowell uses Demsetz's idea of the nirvana approach. Most economists now call it the nirvana fallacy, and try to include lots of quotes in that section too. But I decided not to because honestly, a sibling or cousin of the argument Demsetz makes in his 1969 paper, Information and Efficiency, Another Viewpoint, where the nirvana approach or fallacy hails from, is ubiquitous throughout many of the 11 books written by Thomas Sowell which I've listened to. This is especially true when you consider that Demsetz contrasts what he critiques as the nirvana approach with a preferred method which he refers to as the comparative institutional approach, in which the relevant choice is between real, that is, possible or feasible institutional arrangements. Several of the dozen books of which Thomas Sowell has written have had a title, a subtitle that says something like an international perspective. And the same point is made in the actual title of the main title of his 2004 book, Affirmative Action Around the World. Chapter 1 of that book is also called An International Perspective. Notably, his most popular and best-selling uh, timeless classic, Basic Economics, which was the first of his books I ever listened to, is filled from interesting examples from all around the world. Moreover, unlike any other introductory economics book I have ever come across, whether it be a textbook or an economics book intended for laymen like Basic Economics, it deliberately explains how market economies work by occasional comparisons to peculiar ways in which the economy of the Soviet Union was not able to accomplish tasks so routinely accomplished by the American economy and almost all other Western economies that most readers of basic economics in the United States and the West have never thought about precisely because they work so well. One thing I want to make clear here is that I am not saying Thomas Sowell was only or even mostly a UCLA School economist. Most economists who read his work acknowledge that he is a member or a partial member of the Chicago School of Economics. And this article is in no way an attempt to refute that in any way, shape, or form. I wouldn't refute his Austrian influences either. I've heard him call what I think is his greatest work, Knowledge and Decisions, an ode to Hayek, but I don't recall where exactly. I think it was in an Econ Talk episode from 2008. I think Sowell is such a bold and at times, see a conflict of visions, an original thinker. He defies any fixed label or hardline membership to any single school of economic or intellectual thought. And if you want to hear what the man himself thinks about it, at timestamp 10 minutes and 5 seconds of the YouTube video called Thomas Sowell Brings the World into Focus Through an Economic Lens from the Hoover Institution, the host of the show, Peter Robinson, asks Sowell, as an aside, if he considers himself a member of the Chicago School, and you can see that Sowell quite literally shrugs his shoulders and replies, "I suppose so." Not a disapproving answer, and he certainly did not disagree, but it is also not a full-throated agreement without caveat either. As I was finishing this article, I came across a brief article written by the economist Art Carden for the Cato Institute in 2021 called The Future Field of Sowell Scholarship. And besides the fact that it inspired me to finish writing this article and to do it well, it also has a section in it called Skin in the Game. This is another indication that some of Sowell's lines of argumentation can be compared with the temperamental but lovable Levantine polyglot Nassim Taleb. Perhaps that can be the subject of a future article I write as the field of Sowell scholarship begins to bloom at last. The end.